Year is 1945. The war is over, the collaborators are being rounded up, and a Dutch painter named Han van Meegeren is sitting in a jail cell facing a charge that could get him shot. The charge: selling a masterpiece by Johannes Vermeer, a Dutch national treasure, to Hermann Goering. Treason. The penalty in that particular moment in Dutch history was death. Van Meegeren considered his options, and then he told his interrogators something so improbable that they almost didn't believe him. He said, "I didn't sell them a Vermeer, I painted it myself, every single one." To understand what Han van Meegeren did, you have to understand what was done to him first, or at least, what he believed was done to him. Van Meegeren was born in 1889 in Deventer, a tidy Dutch city of canals and church spires, the son of a schoolteacher who thought art was a waste of time. He painted anyway. By the time he finished his studies at the Delft Academy, he was technically extraordinary, a draftsman of real precision, a student of the old Dutch masters in an era that had largely moved on to cubism and abstraction. And that was the problem. The critics of the 1920s were not interested in a young man who painted like the 17th century. They said so in print repeatedly, and without much kindness. One prominent Dutch critic, Gerard Brom, dismissed him as a skilled but derivative craftsman. The word original was never used in his direction. Van Meegeren took these verdicts personally. "This is documented," he said so to friends in letters over many years. He nursed the slight, and at some point in the 1930s the slight curdled into a plan. The plan required years of preparation, and this is the part of the story that separates Van Meegeren from the merely desperate. He was not improvising, he was engineering. He traveled to Italy, settled for a time in the south of France, and spent the better part of the 1930s conducting what amounted to a private scientific research project into 17th century Dutch painting technique. He sourced genuine period canvases from antique dealers, canvases old enough that the linen itself would pass examination. He made his own pigments from the same raw materials available in Vermeer's era: lapis lazuli for blue, laid white ground by hand, earth pigments dried and mixed in linseed oil. Then came the problem every forger eventually faces: old paint is hard. It has had 300 years to crosslink and harden. Fresh paint, even dry-looking fresh paint, will crack differently, and an expert with a needle can tell the difference in seconds. Van Meegeren solved this. He experimented with a synthetic resin called phenol formaldehyde, bakelite, essentially mixed into his medium. Baked at low heat in a domestic oven, this mixture hardened to a consistency that mimicked aged paint convincingly. He also induced artificial craquelure, the fine web of cracks on old paintings, by rolling the finished canvas over a curved surface. These are not rumors or reconstructions. They were confirmed by chemical analysis during his trial and by his own detailed testimony. The man had essentially invented a way to fake 3 centuries of time. Van Meegeren's first major forgery was not a copy of a known Vermeer. It was an invention, a painting in the style of Vermeer's early period, depicting a scene from the New Testament, Christ and 2 disciples at Emmaus. This was clever. There were no known early religious Vermeers for experts to compare it against. He was painting into a gap in the historical record. In 1937, through an intermediary, a lawyer named Georges de Boer, the painting was submitted for examination to Abraham Bredius, the most celebrated Vermeer scholar in the world. Bredius was 82 years old, still formidable, and he was staggered. He authenticated it. He wrote in the Burlington magazine, a publication of record in the art world, that Christ at Emmaus was, and I quote the documented text here, the masterpiece of Johannes Vermeer of Delft. The Dutch art establishment received this verdict with rapture. The painting was purchased by the Boijmans Museum in Rotterdam for a sum equivalent, in modern terms, to several $1,000,000. It went on public display. Crowds came to see it. Critics who had spent decades sneering at Van Meegeren's talent were, without knowing it, now praising his work in the highest possible terms. He never told anyone, he let them applaud. Emboldened, Van Meegeren painted 5 more fake Vermeers over the following years, along with several false works attributed to Pieter de Hooch. He was living extraordinarily well by this point: multiple properties, parties, the lifestyle of a man who had finally received his due, even if the world didn't know why. Then the German occupation arrived, and the market for old masters became complicated in a very specific way. In 1943, a painting Van Meegeren called Christ and the Adulteress, another invented Vermeer, was sold through a series of intermediaries for a price equivalent to roughly $10 million in today's terms. The buyer at the end of that chain of dealers was Hermann Goering, commander of the Luftwaffe, second in the Nazi hierarchy, and a voracious collector of looted and purchased European art. Goering traded 137 genuine Dutch paintings from his personal collection to acquire this one supposed Vermeer. He hung it in his private estate at Carrenhal. He was, by all accounts, delighted with it. Van Meegeren reportedly was too. Here the historical record is precise on the transaction, but less clear on Van Meegeren's precise motivations. Some later accounts portray him as a man who consciously set out to swindle the Nazis. Others suggest he simply followed the money where it led. His own statements varied depending on his audience. We do not know for certain which is true. What we know is that the money changed hands, and the painting ended up on Goering's wall. After the liberation of the Netherlands in May 1945, Allied investigators began tracing looted art. They found the Vermeer at Karenhal, traced it back through the dealers, and eventually arrived at one name, Han van Meegeren. He was arrested in late May 1945 on suspicion of collaboration, specifically, of selling a Dutch national cultural treasure to an enemy of the state. The charge carried the possibility of execution. Van Meegeren sat in his cell for about 2 weeks. Then, according to his own account, which is corroborated by the testimony of the investigating officers, he asked to speak to someone in authority and made his confession. He had not sold the Dutch patrimony to Goering. He had sold Goering a fake. In fact, he had been faking Vermeers for years. The investigating officers were skeptical. They were, frankly, inclined to think this was a desperate man inventing a story, so they proposed a test. If Van Meegeren was truly capable of producing a 17th-century Dutch masterpiece from scratch, he would do it again, under supervision, in a studio, with witnesses present, with no access to any genuine old masterwork. What followed was one of the more unusual scenes in the history of criminal proceedings. Han van Meegeren, under house arrest in Amsterdam, with detectives and court-appointed witnesses present in the room, produced a painting. He called it the Young Christ teaching in the temple. He worked in the same manner he had used for the forgeries: period pigments, his hardening medium, the aged canvas. He was 56 years old, in poor health. He had developed a serious heart condition, and his years of hard living had taken their toll. He painted slowly. The witnesses watched every brushstroke. When the work was finished, it was subjected to the same chemical and physical analysis that had been applied, retrospectively, to his other paintings. The results were consistent. Analysis confirmed the same unusual resin compound, the same pigment composition, the same artificially induced aging techniques. The forgery committee appointed by the Dutch government concluded that Van Meegeren had indeed been the author of the works he claimed. Christ at Emmaus, the one that had fooled Bredius and delighted the Boijmans, was a fake. So were the others, and so, by ironic consequence, was the one Goering had prized so highly. The treason charge evaporated. The charge of fraud remained. Van Meegeren went to trial in October 1947. The charge was deception and forgery. By this point, something remarkable had happened to his public reputation. The Dutch press and much of the public had decided that a man who had swindled Hermann Goering was not exactly a villain. There was a constituency that found it difficult to feel indignant about defrauding a Nazi. Graffiti appeared in Amsterdam, documented in newspaper accounts of the time, calling Van Meegeren a national hero. He played the part. He was charming, articulate, and not without a gift for self-presentation. He was convicted. The court sentenced him to 1 year in prison. He never served it. On the 10th of December 1947, 6 weeks after sentencing, Han van Meegeren suffered a heart attack. He died at the age of 58 in a private clinic in Amsterdam. Now, where did the money go? This is the part of the story that tends to get lost. Van Meegeren had earned the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars from his forgeries during the occupation years. The Dutch government moved to recover these proceeds. His estate was seized. His properties, including a substantial country house and a collection of genuine antiques, were liquidated by court order to compensate the defrauded buyers and the Dutch state. The precise final accounting took years after his death to resolve, and the records are held in Dutch national archives. His legitimate heirs received very little. The paintings themselves, the forgeries, occupy a peculiar afterlife. They hang in museums, clearly labeled as Van Meegeren's, studied as extraordinary technical achievements in their own right. Christ at Emmaus remains in the Boijmans collection in Rotterdam. The irony would not have been lost on the man himself. The critics finally gave him a place on the museum wall. It just took a criminal conviction to put him there. Which leaves a question I keep returning to, and I'll leave it with you. If you had been on that Dutch jury in 1947, knowing that his most famous victim wore a Luftwaffe uniform, would you have convicted him?